Welcome to the gallery walkthrough of The Rise and Fall of Vladimir Lenin. Before we begin the walkthrough, here's a quick overview of Vladimir Lenin. He was born April 22nd, 1870 to a well-off family. His family placed a great emphasis on the intelligence of their children, and this thinking led to Lenin internalizing his family's ideals, which included emphasis on education, scientific endeavors, and fulfilling their duty to society. And this way of thinking is what ultimately led to Lenin's focus on all things intellectual and the ways he viewed many of his ideals and his dictatorship later on in life. Lenin wasn't initially interested in revolutionary ideas, which is why our first object is a noose, which represents the catalyst of Lenin's introduction to revolution and also Marxism. Lenin's brother Sasha was involved with a group who wanted to attempt to assassinate the Tsar, and after being caught, Sasha was hung as an example to not end the Tsar's life and to stop revolutionaries from doing so. His death led to Lenin having a thirst for revenge after many people looked down on his family because of his brother's actions, and he began to get more into revolutionary ideas, especially Marxist text and Marx's idea of surplus value. The next item on our walkthrough is an Iskra pamphlet. After the death of his brother, Lenin began to participate in a lot more revolutionary activities, notably a lot of protests that ended up violent and got him in a lot of trouble, which eventually led to his exile in 1897. He was exiled to Siberia, which is where he met his first love, Nadia, who joined him in his exile and also helped him begin to publish Iskra pamphlets. These pamphlets ultimately led to him spreading the ideals that he believed. So it acted as almost a party newspaper. And Iskra means spark in Russian. And Lenin's catchphrase for the pamphlet was "A single start can start a prairie fire," which ultimately was the catalyst for his whole socialist movement using Marxist principles, but also Marxist principles tweaked a bit in a way that Lenin put his own ideals in there and made them seem a bit Marxist to appeal to more people. The next item on our walkthrough is a map of all the places that Vladimir Lenin traveled during his work as a revolutionary. From the start of his time as a revolutionary to the beginning of the Russian Revolution, Lenin traveled around the world, not staying in one place for a long time. He began in Russia in 1870, and then after being targeted by Okhrana agents, he asked to go on a 4-month trip to Austria, Switzerland, France, and Germany to visit revolutionaries, which they approved in hopes that the people would forget about him. When they didn't, he was exiled to Siberia for 3 years, and after this, he went to London again after his exile was over to escape Okhrana. After that, he went to Geneva and Switzerland to be closer to Russia, and eventually went to both Paris and Poland in attempts to get into Russia until he was eventually helped in by Germans. Our next object is a picture of the stage 1 of the coup, which ultimately happened while Vladimir Lenin was still out of the country. The coup began with a women's protest about the lack of bread on International Women's Day, but after 3 days, most soldiers from the Tsar's army joined in, which ultimately forced Nicholas to not be able to survive because of the defection of the military. The next day, Nicholas advocated the throne, which ultimately put the revolutionaries in power. After the initial coup, tensions between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks began to get worse, and during the July days, which were a series of violent street demonstrations, the Mensheviks put out an arrest warrant for Vladimir Lenin, which is our next object. Due to this search warrant, Lenin flew to Finland and published The State and the Revolution, which described the ideal state Lenin planned to establish to the people, purposely filled with lies to entrance them. He planned to save the Russian provisional government from a plot to overturn it, which ultimately led to people seeing the Bolsheviks as heroes in this moment instead of the people who were planning to overturn the government as a whole. After this publishment, Lenin came back disguised as a Finnish Lutheran pastor in order to begin the next revolution, which was the October Revolution. The next item in our walkthrough is a feather, because after the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin said that the victory was as easy as picking up a feather. The October Revolution followed up the July days and was the result of growing tensions between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Lenin decided that he was just going to act, so on October 25th, he began the changing of the guard, which was the overthrow of the Russian provisional government. At 6 a.m., the state bank fell. At 7 a.m., the central telephone exchange, post office, and telegraph building fell. And at 8 a.m., the railroad stations were taken over. And by 2 a.m. the next morning, the Roman provisional government was no more, and Lenin claimed victory, despite many people not even knowing the revolution was happening at the time. The day after the revolution, Lenin claimed his victory and began his rule. One of the most important things he established was the Cheka, which was a secret military group that only answered to him and was almost a pre-KGB type group. In his first year, he wanted every state to cease the war, but they didn't like this, so instead he sent Russian negotiators to Germany to attempt to get land back, but they eventually failed, which caused a lack of trust of the Russian people in Lenin. Eventually, this negotiation did end their part in the war, and Russians wanted to begin to legitimize their government. After the end of the war, Lenin sought to legitimize his government through elections, and he only ended up winning 24% of the votes, so he banned right-wing parties and allowed a democratic all-power assembly where they entered from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., but after this only 12 hours of democracy, he claimed the will of the people was to close the democracy in order to stay in power. Our second to last object on our walkthrough is the 2 bullets that Vladimir Lenin was shot with. Though many people attempted to murder Lenin after his rise to power, nobody came as close as Fanny Kathman, who shot him twice in the arm and chest, and doctors left both bullets in his body after the accident. She believed that Lenin was pushing the ideas of socialism back and was allowing the government to contain tales of war violence, which wasn't positive for the people. After the assassination attempt, Lenin was much more popular and people were much more open to his ideas, but as time went on, he began to get more ill. In 1921, he suffered blackouts, exhaustion, and wheezing, ultimately caused by the lead in the bullets of his body. After this, he did put in place the new economic policy, which reinstated many capitalist elements, which opened up the economy to foreign investors. But barely a year after this, in 1922, he had his first recorded stroke, which left him temporarily paralyzed and impeded his speech for the rest of his life. 2 years after that, he didn't do very much politically because he was too ill, and he eventually couldn't walk and couldn't speak by the beginning of 1924. Lenin died on January 21st, 1924. He left with us his last testament through his wife, in which he warned about Stalin-led rule, not technically glorifying Trotsky, but putting him above Stalin in his ranking of people who should succeed him. Despite this, Stalin was the one who succeeded him after his death and took over the USSR. Our last object on the walkthrough is a cat, because I think there are many similarities between Lenin and a cat, and it's a very easy way to remember some of his characteristics. When looking at a cat versus Lenin, there are 3 main juxtapositions that I looked at that really helped me understand him. Cats don't like to be stared at, so they want their owners to be scared of them. In this way, Lenin stayed out of the spotlight, creating a frightening persona to scare everyone who wanted to see him away, but not actually letting anybody look the real him in the face. Number 2, the sickness of felines can often spread to their human companions. This reflects the way that Lenin's actions greatly impacted the well-being of his people, specifically in things like Germany negotiations, the gulags, and the Red and White Terrors. He didn't really think of their well-being, just of what he thought was right for them. And then the third and final thing is that if cats don't have anything else to eat, they'll eat you, starting with your face. And in this way, Lenin defeated his enemies and his friends with no distinction between the two. He started with the head of their organization or group and defeated them so that he could stay in power, because that was ultimately his main priority.